My name is Brent Michael Bloom. I was born June 14th of 1958 here in Omaha. My parents are Harold and Dina Bloom. We lived at 2502 North 53rd Street, which apparently prior to that time, prior to when I was born, or maybe around when I was born, was a Jewish neighborhood. By the time I can remember, in the 1960s, many of the Jewish families had moved further west into what they call Bagel Hill, near Glenwood Road and Western. Some of the families that I recall being talked about having lived near that 53rd and Lake area were Maury and Libby Sachs, who were friends of my parents, and they lived across the street to the south. Joe and Adele Hornstein, who lived on Country Club Avenue. Dr. Haskell Morris, the Lintzmans, the Wallners, the Platts. I'm sure there are many others, but those were names that I heard growing up. The Scheikens lived up the street, the Zorinskis, the Forbeses. So I had 3 siblings, twin brothers, Bernard and Bruce, and they were 18 years older than me. They were born in June of 1940, and they graduated high school the year that I was born. My sister Beverly Fellman was born about 18 months or so after my brothers. She was about 16 and a half years older than me. And so they were pretty much out of the house when I was born. I have recollections of my brothers going off to study in medical school, and their weddings were more in focus. I was older then. My sister was married when I was about 5. So, right. A little bit more about my parents and my grandparents, and then my siblings. I'll try to order my thoughts a little bit. My father, Harold Bloom, his parents were Sam and Lena Diamond. I'm sorry, Sam and Lena Bloom. Lena was a diamond. That was her maiden name. Sam and Lena both came over from Latvia separately. They got married in Omaha. And I think I've seen and maybe have a copy of an invitation to their wedding. I know a little bit more about Sam's family. His Hebrew name was actually Yeshayahu. He was Shaya in Yiddish, but he went by Sam. And we have the ship's manifest that shows when he came over, and that he came over to live with his brother Nathan, whose name in Yiddish was Nachum. I've done some research, and I found that Sam was the last child of 2 sibling strips of his father. His father was married and had 5 children by his first wife, Michla, and then had 5 children by his second wife, after apparently his first wife died, and his second wife was Chana Vichna. And they were from the area of Latvia near Riga, although not in Riga. I've been able to trace his family back through birth and death and marriage records that are available online to around 1790. I even found I think it would be Sam's grandfather or great-grandfather. I don't have my notes with me. I should have brought them, for whom he's named. So I've just done that in the last year or so, and that's quite exciting, and I have those notes. And should you be viewing this at some time when I'm not around, hopefully you found that file in my office. The Diamond family's a little harder to research. I haven't found very much about them. What it appears is that they came from an area in the Pale of Settlement, and were perhaps from a shtetl there. Abner Rubin used to say that we were kissing cousins through that side of the family, and he was from somewhere called Varklan, and the joke was that he named his dog Varklan because not even a dog should have to live the way they lived in Varklan. The story I got about Sam ending up in the United States is that he and two of his brothers and one of his sisters emigrated across the Baltic from Latvia to Sweden and lived there for a while, and Sam could speak Swedish, is what my dad told me. He and his two brothers, Nachum and Mani Laser, and his sister Frida, I believe, although I'm not sure about Frida, went to Sweden and then to the United States. I take that back. Manny Laser stayed in Sweden, and in fact there are relatives still in Sweden that we've been in touch with. And in my materials somewhere there's correspondence that Sam had with his, I guess his brothers or his brothers' kids in Sweden. Nathan or Nachum came first, settled on South 13th Street. Sam came over with Nachum's wife and child, is what the ship's manifest says. And he had $50 with him when he came. And I think he was originally a shoemaker or a cobbler, and later got into horse trading, and later into the car business, which is the business that my father and his brothers and my grandfather Sam were in, as I remember them. Although I remember my grandfather being retired, Sam being retired mostly. So Manny Laser stayed in Sweden. I found the marriage records of Frida, and she got married in 1901 in Latvia to someone with the last name Zilbert. And I have vague recollections of my father and his family talking about Sam's sister Frida having the last name Silver, which would make sense, Zilbert or Silver, and living somewhere in California, although now that seems to be lost. I haven't been able to track that family down. His brother Nachum and his wife also lived in Omaha, although from what I can tell, his wife, Nachum's wife, was ill and passed away, or I don't know exactly what happened. They had 3 children, Dora and Walter and Morris. Dora apparently was briefly married to someone named Wolfson and kept the name Wolfson. I remember meeting Dora and Walter and Morris. None of them had any children. Their father, Nachum, died in 1924, and I found the newspaper article that describes that he had been sick and apparently quite depressed about that. Dora and Walter and Morris survived. I believe Walter and Morris were both veterans, and remember, I think Walter living in the old veterans home on 156th and Maple. Lena, I wasn't as familiar with her relatives or her brothers, because they had passed, I believe, by the time I was able to know anything. She had one brother, Abraham, who they called Avram Yankel, and his wife was Tante Chayentel, and they had a number of children. My brothers could tell you more of this. They've passed, and so has my sister. And I don't know the Diamond side as well. I know that Abraham was a butcher and a mohel and performed my bris. I was born prematurely, and my mother would tell stories of how he would come and check for I guess it was quite a while after I was born, to see when I was ready to have my Brit Milah. And then there was another brother, Diamond, Henoch, Uncle Henoch, who I believe they called Hank. He lived in Iowa, and there was some problem with his wife, died or left, I don't know, but they had one child, Sarah Diamond, who was about the same age as my dad's youngest sibling, Shirley Bloom Rosenzweig. And so Sarah came to live with them. Sarah later married Harold Nepomnick, and they adopted 2 children, Jill and Rick. And then Harold, they lived in Houston, Texas. Harold died. Sarah recently passed after having remarried Wilton Masters. The Diamond family in Omaha had a meat market. There was another Diamond, Oscar, that had, I think it was called Northside Poultry. And his kids were Billy and Richard. I believe Richard still lives in Omaha. We're not close. My mother's side of the family, her parents were Ben and Bessie Himmelblum. So she only had to change her name a little bit when she got married. Her parents both died when she was very young. Her mother died, I don't have these dates solidly in my mind. My mom was born, my dad was born in 1913. He was the second of his siblings. My mom was born in 1921 here in Omaha. Both my folks were born in Omaha. Ben came over, the story is, and his name was Hirsch Bear actually, or Barrel, but he went by the name Ben. And he had a bakery on North 24th Street, about 24th and Hamilton, Himmelblum's Bakery, which he built. And I believe I have those documents for the building of his building and the purchase of the land. So he had come over before the First World War to make money and then send for his wife Bessie, Sorabasa. And then the First World War broke out and they were unable to come. He came in 1913, I believe. I have those documents too. And they had already had one child. Actually, the child was born after he left. I believe my Aunt Ruth was the same age as my dad, born in 1913. And I think he got on the boat a couple months before she was born, or maybe right after. I don't have those dates right with me. He came over, was going to make money, had a connection to the baking business in the Midwest. First went to Des Moines, came through the port of Galveston unusually, didn't come through Ellis Island. And the war broke out and he made enough money and deposited money with a steamship line, and it was a couple of years before his wife and daughter could even make it over. They got here in 1920. I think the ship's manifest says they landed in New York in May of 1920. And so my mom's sister, who went by Ruth, in Yiddish she was Rachel Leah, got to Omaha, and my mom was born promptly thereafter in June of 1921. Her mother died in, I think, about 1928, and her father died shortly thereafter in 1933 or so, after he had remarried to Leah Edelstein, who Ruth had known. So the story is that Ruth fixed up her dad and his second wife, Leah. Leah was my mom's stepmom, and Dina took care of Leah through her whole life. She had a couple more husbands. She had bad luck with men. I think she buried 4 husbands. And in the end, moved to Omaha from Chicago, and my mom took care of her till the end. She died in 1972. Sam Bloom died in 1972. Lena Bloom died in 1960. My mom had two siblings, like I talked about, Ruth and Yale Himmelblum, who was Ben Himmelblum's son with Leah Edelstein. And Yale had three kids. One has passed away. They lived in Waukegan and then in Richmond, Virginia. His wife Edith, as of now, is still alive, as are his son Brian, who lives in Kodiak, Alaska, and Sherry, who also lives in Richmond, Virginia. Ruth passed away in the mid-'80s. She never had any kids. She was married twice. Her first husband, Sam Cora, and her second husband, Gil Scharf. Sam died of diabetes-related problems. My father had, his older sibling was Will Bloom, and then my dad in 1913 was born. Will was born in 1911. His sister Helen came next. Helen was married to Maury Roginski, and they were in the grocery business and other businesses. They settled eventually in Las Vegas. They have one son, Alan. And then Milt Bloom, who was in the family car business for many years and ended up working for Rosa Novak for many years. Milt was married to Esther, whose maiden name was also Bloom, and they had two daughters, Nancy and Sheila, who live in Arizona. Nancy has two kids, Ben and Sarah has two children, Max and Ella. And then Shirley Rosenzweig was the youngest sibling. Shirley was born in 1926, and Will's oldest child was born in 1930. I'll get to that in a minute. Shirley married Norm Rosenzweig. They met at the University of Nebraska. They moved to Seattle, and they have three. They both are passed away now. All my dad's siblings are gone. They had three kids: Betty Barber, who goes by Bieber, who lives in Alabama; Shelley, who married Jack Zucker. They live part-time in Arizona and part-time in the Seattle area; and David, who married Karen, and they live in the Seattle area. David and Karen have two daughters. Shelley and Jack have a daughter and a son, and Bieber never had any kids. Will has three kids, all of whom are still alive. The oldest is Dorothy. She was born in 1930. Will was 19 at the time and had married Flora Feldman. After Dorothy, they had Neil. Neil lives in Minneapolis. He has two kids and he has grandkids. His kids are Scott and Shayna. And Larry, we always called him Lori, he lives in the San Diego area, and he has two sons. Dorothy has three kids. She's 28 years older than me. She's the oldest in the cousins on the Bloom side, and I'm the youngest. She has three kids, I think all of whom are older than me, interestingly enough. And she has numerous children and grandchildren. She is still around. She's 88. She has a husband who's 90, and they still drive. They're very active. I just saw them recently, and they're lovely people. Oh, I think I've got all the family history. Okay. I just want to say a little bit about my siblings, and then I'll talk about me. So my brothers Bernard and Bruce started off to be engineers and architects and went to MIT and then Case Western Reserve. Of course, I was a small child at the time. They ended up being doctors, going to medical school and being doctors. Bernard settled in Dallas and married Naomi Weisenfeld. They have three children. The oldest is Jason, who's a jury consultant. Evan is next, and he's in real estate and lives in Dallas. Both Jason and Evan live in Dallas. And Stacy, who is going to get married this December, and she lives in Dallas as well. She's a PhD school psychologist. Bernard passed in February of 2014. His widow Naomi still lives in Dallas. Bruce, and Bernard was a plastic surgeon. Bruce was an ear, nose, and throat doctor. He settled in the Washington, D.C. area and lived in Potomac, Maryland for many years. He died in March of 2000. He has 2 kids, Adam and Lisa. Neither of them have any kids, but Adam and his wife Talia are expecting now. I take that back. Got to edit this. Lisa has 1 child that she had on her own, Brooke, and Brooke is now about 4. So I stand corrected. Beverly and his Bruce's wife is Arlene, and she still lives in the Potomac, Maryland area. Beverly married Dick Fellman, who was a prominent lawyer and politician here in Omaha. He's still alive. He's in his early 80s. They got married in 1963 in Omaha at Beth Israel. And they have 4 kids and numerous grandkids. Their daughter Susie is a physician that lives here. Debbie lives in Los Angeles. She doesn't have any children. John is married to Michelle Worth Fellman, and they live in Chicago. They have 2 daughters and a son. Their eldest daughter is about ready to graduate high school, as is Sue's daughter. And she married Isaac Witkowski. They're both physicians. John is an investment banker. Debbie works in communications. Daniel, the youngest, is a rabbi. He and his wife Melissa live in Syracuse, New York, where he's a Reform rabbi, and they have 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. I grew up at 53rd and Lake. My parents lived there until they couldn't live in that house anymore. I went to Rose Hill Grade School. I was, for a time, the only Jew in that grade school. The Jews had pretty much moved away from that neighborhood. It's still a lovely neighborhood. I was supposed to go to Monroe Junior High. That was the area junior high, but my parents wanted me to have exposure to other Jewish kids, and instead sent me to Lewis and Clark, where I met many Jewish kids, some of whom I'm still friends with today. People who were my age who went to Lewis and Clark include Larry Novak, Barry Hoberman, Mike Perlman, Sue Schwartz, Marlene Belmont Sukanik, Shelley Alloy Fox, Debbie Denenberg. I'm sure there's more. Lewis and Clark was very, very Jewish at that time, and most of my friends lived just in the few blocks surrounding Lewis and Clark in that area they called Bagel or Bagel Hill. I grew up at Beth Israel Synagogue, going to Hebrew school for what seemed like all the time. Tuesday and Thursday or Monday and Wednesday nights, Saturday morning for junior congregation in the basement of the school wing, and Sunday morning for Sunday school again. We lived close enough that I could walk back and forth, or my parents would drop me off, my mom. Had my bar mitzvah at Beth Israel. Some of the teachers there that I remember in the 1960s, they brought in some Israelis. Mr. Ovadia and Batya Brand was a teacher from Israel. Riva Ruderman worked in the office for many years. My Aunt Flora worked in the synagogue office for many years. Flora Bloom, Will's wife. Lots and lots of Hebrew school. I was bar mitzvahed there in 1971. Rabbi Nadoff was the rabbi. Cantor Gelbart was the cantor. Rabbi Nadoff was a gentleman and a really nice guy. I was a little bit active in SYO, the Synagogue Youth Organization there. I became more active in youth activities when I joined AZA 1 in 9th grade. And a lot of my friends, who I'm still friends with, were in AZA 1 at the time. Again, Larry Novak and Barry Hoberman. Some other names, John Freeman, David Finkel, Myron Kaplan, Mark Hockenberg, John Freeman, I think maybe I said John Freeman, Dave Parso, Dave Ruback, Larry Kelberg, and we were very active. AZA was very active. We had a sweetheart dance every year. That was our big fundraiser and our huge event. Our rivals were the Jaimes, we called them, Chaim Weitzman, AZA 1510. It seemed like most of the kids from Central joined AZA 1, and maybe more of the kids from West Side joined Weitzman 1510. There was also AZA 100, and there were some Central kids in there too. Justin Cooper was in AZA 100, I remember that. But I went to Lewis and Clark through the 9th grade. I went to Central High from 10th through 12th grade, and hung out a lot with those guys from AZA 1 at Central. And so we socialized, and we had our AZA activities. I was a dance chairman one year. And that was a big part of my life during high school. I was also in journalism. I was the sports editor of the Central High Register in 1976. That was the year that I graduated. So the school year 75, 76, I was the sports editor. Other notables that were at Central, one other notable at Central that year was Peter Buffett, the son of Warren Buffett. He was a photographer, nice guy. So I worked with him on the paper. Our whole family were Central High. My mom went to Central High before she had to move to Chicago to finish high school because that's what her stepmother wanted to do. Both my brothers and my sister went to Central High. My sister Beverly taught at Central High as a young teacher in the mid-1960s, and then came back to Central High and taught French, and eventually became the chair of the Foreign Language Department, International Language Department there until she retired. And Beverly passed away on New Year's Eve 2015, 2016, I believe is when she passed. Let's see. So yeah, high school was mostly hanging out with the Jewish kids. I had a couple of friends from journalism, Bob Heckel and Steve Swanson, who remain friends to this day. A couple other names from Central, Stuart Hart and Stuart Kalnick. Mark Simon. I initially got a scholarship. I thought I wanted to be a doctor like my brothers, but was ill-suited to study science, and got a scholarship to the University of Denver as a chemistry major, and then I was a biology major. I think I ended up a psychology major there. I enjoyed my time in Denver, but I think I lacked direction, and I felt bad about that. And I came back to Omaha to live with my folks, and got my degree in psychology and philosophy from Creighton University in 1980. That's where I met my wife, Rebecca. Her maiden name is Bleicher. She has 6 brothers. She's the youngest. Her brothers are Norm, Joel, Paul, Dan, and John. I don't think I missed anybody. Sorry, Joel, Paul, Bob, Dan, Bob, and John. I should know that after 37 years. And they live all over the country. John lives here. He has 2 kids, grown, and a couple of grandkids. Bob lives in Lincoln. The rest of them are scattered across the U.S., and Dan and his family live in Israel. Rebecca and I got married in 1981, in a little synagogue in Council Bluffs called B'nai Israel, where her father was very active, and we later became active. Perhaps more about that later. Rebecca and I went off to Idaho, where I was accepted to law school, and she was accepted to get a master's degree in art. And I graduated from law school in 1984, and she got her master's the same year. We lived in Moscow, Idaho. It was a very nice time in our lives. Moscow was a beautiful place. I got a job with the Legal Aid Society of Idaho, Idaho Legal Aid Services, in Pocatello. And we lived there for a couple of years, and while we were there, we got pregnant with Alex, our first son. We came back to Omaha for Daniel Fellman's bar mitzvah in December of 1972. And while we were here, my brother-in-law Dick, who was a lawyer and a politician, very involved in Democrat politics here in Omaha, said, hey, as long as you're here, you should go interview with the public defender and with the city prosecutor and with the county prosecutor, who were all people he knew and had practiced with for many years. So I did, never thinking really anything would come of it, but they wanted us back. And of course, all the grandparents were still alive. And lo and behold, a couple months later, I did get a call from Tom Kenny, who was the public defender at that time, asking me when I could start. So I got a job with the public defender's office in 1986. Rebecca's parents, Jerome and Frida, were still alive. My parents, Harold and Dina, were still alive. Jerome and Frida, he was a doctor, she was a nurse. They lived on a farm about halfway between Council Bluffs and Glenwood. Both her parents died in 2003. My dad died in 2004 in March, and my mom died in July of 2005. So let's see. I was just telling the story to Joni Bernstein, who's interviewing me, about my grandfather, Ben Himmelblum, that he was a big guy. None of us are really big people, and that he had a size 19 neck. And I remember my mom showing me a picture, and I don't know where this picture is, of him sitting in a school kid's desk when he went to take English lessons in a school in Omaha at some point. And my mom used to tell the story that he would say, "Speak to me in English, I'm an American." And on the other side of the family, my dad used to talk about his mother, who always wanted to be talked to in Yiddish. And I'm one of that generation of people where my parents spoke Yiddish, and when they didn't want me to know what they were saying, they talked in Yiddish. So I picked up just enough Yiddish to be able to swear and talk about food, I think. I think that's about all I know. So I'll talk about B'nai Israel Synagogue a little bit. Jerome Bleicher was very interested in keeping that synagogue alive. It's a historic landmark now in Council Bluffs. And when we came back, he wanted us to be involved. And he invited me to go to a board meeting one night. When I first dated Rebecca, he would find me on a Sunday morning, and he'd take me over to Minyan at B'nai Israel, and it would be a bunch of really old guys, Simon Scheichen maybe, and Eddie Tepperman, and I mean, these guys seemed ancient. They were probably in their 80s at the time. And so he'd been involved from very early on, and I got to know it a little bit. And when we came back, after being married there, we had a natural affinity toward that synagogue. And we started attending services there with her dad. And then he invited me to come to a board meeting one evening, and I didn't go, which was a mistake, because while I wasn't there, they elected me president. And so I was president there in the late 80s. And we had sort of a ragtag group of devotees. And for a while, we associated with the Reconstructionist movement. And we had a couple rabbis come, part-time rabbis, that either flew in as students, or we had one rabbi, Ruth Ehrenstein, who lived here and had another job and was part-time rabbi, a job in the Jewish community, was a part-time rabbi for us. That synagogue split over the issue of money and whether the synagogue should move to Omaha in the mid-1990s, 1994, 1995. And Alan and Sandra Kurland kept it alive. And now it's been reinvigorated. Marty Ricks and the Wolves and some other people have regenerated that synagogue. The other group went and formed a group called Beit Shalom, who held services at a Unitarian church. And I'm not sure what's up with them, if they're still a Chavurah or what they do. When the split came, we moved to Temple Israel, which was my wife's family's synagogue. And both our sons, Alex, who was born in October of 1988, and Eli, who was born in Alex was born in October of 1986, and Eli was born in April of 1988. They were both bar mitzvahed there and finished their Hebrew school there. While we were at B'nai Israel, we had a Hebrew school and we had services. It was very do-it-yourself, but it was very gratifying. When we moved to Omaha, Rebecca and I, we first lived in a trailer on her dad's farm. But my boss told me I had to live in Douglas County if I was going to work for the Douglas County Public Defender. That's the way they did it then. And we moved to a little house in sort of south of Field Club, south of Center on 35th Avenue, 2322 South 35th Avenue. And we lived there until Alex was almost ready for school. And the house was just a 2-bedroom and it was too small. And we kind of by accident found a house in Ponca Hills, just at the very southern edge of Ponca Hills in Omaha, near the Mormon Bridge. And Ponca School was rated as one of the best at that time, so we decided that we would move there. We renovated that home and moved in. We bought it in 1991. We still live there. And we raised Alex and Eli there. They both went to Ponca School because they were bar mitzvah at Temple Israel, and Temple Israel was right across the street from Lewis and Clark, and we wanted them to go to Lewis and Clark and meet Jewish kids just like my parents wanted me to. We sent them to Lewis and Clark and to Temple. Rabbi Azrael bar mitzvahed both of them. And they went to Central High as well. While my sister taught there, and Rebecca taught there for a little while too. Rebecca was an art teacher and taught at Central, and she taught at the Lewis Central System in Council Bluffs. She taught at Brownell as a sub, I think, for a little while. But in 1999, she's always had a farming passion. Her father farmed in his part-time. He was a gastroenterologist and general surgeon in South Omaha. Well, it's the middle of September, just between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I found out that after I did the first part of this, the recording didn't work. So I've had a chance to review the first part of the recording that survived, and I get a second chance to come back and fix any errors that I had in the first part and continue on with what I think I might have said in the second part. A couple things that I noticed from looking at the first 35 minutes or so was I failed to mention that my brother Bruce died very young. He died in the year 2000, and he was only 59 years old. It was a big shock to all of us, obviously, especially to my parents. Another thing, I think when I was mentioning my wife Rebecca's brothers, and the ones that lived around here, I failed to mention Joel Bleicher, who lives in the area in Council Bluffs, and he's a retired plastic surgeon. He and his wife Sandy live here, and they have 4 adult children. Another piece that I've learned since I last spoke to you, Camera, is I went to a wedding of Shelley Rosenzweig's son. So she's now Shelley Zucker. So her mom was Shirley Bloom, my dad's youngest sibling. And in part of her son's wedding, they said her Hebrew name. And I noticed that her Hebrew name, at least part of it, was Frida. She said that it was Yehuda Frida. Frida is the name of my grandfather, Sam Bloom's sister, that I have never been able to find anything on in the genealogy work, at least to date. And I asked Shelley at the wedding reception, do you know who you're named after? And she said, well, I think I was named after, what they told me is I was named after somebody nobody really liked, which she kind of made light of and made a joke about it. And my theory is that she was named after my Zadie's sister, Frida, who all I know about is that she was married in 1901 in Latvia to a guy named Zilbert. But now I know that if my cousin Shelley, who was born in 1952, was named after her, I'm reasonably certain that she had passed, that Frida had passed before 1952, since Jews don't normally name children, babies, after people who are alive. So it's a hint. Anyway, it was an interesting little piece that I wanted to pass on for posterity. I think when I left off, I hadn't really talked about my life, my kids, the children that Rebecca and I have, or my grandkids, or the life that Rebecca and I have had here in Omaha. So I believe I mentioned both Alex and Eli and their birth dates. They went to Ponca School, they went to Lewis and Clark Junior High, they went to Central High. Both of them were runners. They ran cross country at Central. They both had bar mitzvahs at Temple Israel. They were good students. They always worked during the summers or went on adventures, and they were a joy, really, to raise. I often think back upon the time when they were in grade school and junior high as really being a wonderful time in our lives. My mom would pick them up at school when they were in junior high, and they would spend a couple hours with her at her house until I came after work to pick them up. And that I think continues to be a good memory for them. After high school, Alex went to the University of Denver and graduated from there with degrees in business and in economics. He married in 2014 Nina Simon, and they have 2 wonderful children, Amaris, who's going to be 5 in November, and Theo they call him, is 2. He was born in May, so he's almost 2.5 now. They live in a nice little house in Omaha. Alex works for the assessor, Douglas County assessor, and Nina is in a 1-year accelerated nursing program right now. So they were married at Temple Israel here in Omaha. Eli, I should give their full names: Alexander Samuel and Elias Harrison. Alex was named after my Zadie. Eli was named after a couple of people. He was named after Harry Rubenstein, who was a favorite uncle of Rebecca's, and Harold Nepomnic, who was sort of a favorite uncle of mine, and his children never had any children, so we kind of gave a nod to him. He was married to Sarah Diamond, who was, I think I talked about that she was raised basically as a sibling of my dad's. Eli is currently finishing his PhD at Washington State University. He studies pollinators. He's an entomologist, and he has done a project that looks at pollinators and their effect on urban gardens and organic farms. He'll hopefully finish in March or June, somewhere in there, of 2019, and then go on either, I don't know, he's talking about a government job, he's talking about maybe academia, I don't know. He has a girlfriend he's had for 4 or 5 years now. Her name is Liz DeOria, and she's a wonderful young woman who's also an entomologist and has a job in entomology at Michigan State University. Eli studied briefly in Australia over the last year or so, and I was lucky enough to be able to go visit him there and travel around Australia and New Zealand with him. It was a wonderful time. Let's see. Talk about Rebecca's career a little bit. Rebecca was trained as an art teacher, and for the she stayed home with the kids mostly. She did some art teaching at Joslin Art Museum until the kids were old enough to go to school, and then she went back to work, and she worked as an art teacher at Central High and at Lewis Central in Council Bluffs, and she subbed at Brownell. And then she always farmed, she always gardened, and this is something that is common in her family. They all like to grow things, and her father had a farm, I think I mentioned that, and at least 3 of her brothers have maybe 4, maybe more, have lived on farms and run farms and always had gardens. So she was always working and gardening, and then in 1999 we purchased a piece of land near Crescent, Iowa, that she's been farming since then. So 18 years, pretty much. And she built a greenhouse on there and a high tunnel and a very cool passive solar designed home that doubles as a processing area. She's just in the process of selling that now. But she was certified organic and just worked her fingers to the bone, producing vegetables and fruits and herbs for people. For a few years, we did community-supported agriculture, where people bought a share of the produce up front in the spring, and then got a box delivered to them every week. For 2 years, she did that with Temple. For 1 year, she did it with another, maybe 2 years with another group. She sold to a lot of chefs and nice restaurants in Omaha. She sold in farmers markets, and now she's looking at finding something else to do. My career, in 1986, when we moved back here from Idaho, I think I told that story in part 1 of the Brent Bloom Chronicles. I worked for the public defender for 3 years, and that was supposedly sort of back then they tried to have representation from various ethnic groups or groups in the culture, and Bennett Hornstein, may he rest in peace, had just died. He was in the public defender's office, and I think it was fortuitous that I had applied, because I think my boss wanted to fill that vacancy with another Jewish guy. So I was one of the Jewish guys in the public defender's office at that time. After 3 years, I decided I wanted to try it out in the private sector, and I went in with Don Fiddler, who was a prominent criminal defense lawyer and marijuana advocate. He practiced lawyers. Deborah Pred had just left his practice, and Marty Kushner was in with him. Marty's also passed, probably 20 years ago now. And Don, that was a very interesting introduction to private practice. We had a lot of fun, and we became friends. I learned a lot about how to work in a private law office. And after about a year, Don went off to become the executive director of the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. So the practice was closed. Marty went one way, I went another. I rented a small office downtown, and I've stayed there on and off since then. Along about that time, in the early 90s, I found that stress was a problem for me. And the culture at that time was either you were a runner, or maybe you played racquetball or some sport like that, or you went out after work and drank. And none of those really worked for me. And so at Rebecca's suggestion, I think I took up yoga. And after about a year or so, it kind of took, and I became very interested in yoga. After about 5 years with my teacher here in Omaha, Susie Amendola, I got trained to be a teacher, and I've taught ever since as sort of a part-time thing. For the past 11 years, I've taught as an adjunct at UNO. People come to my classes and get 1 credit, college credit for doing yoga with me once a week for 100 minutes. I found that to be very satisfying. As part of that sideways move, I also went to massage school. There is a form of massage called Thai yoga or Thai massage, which is sort of doing yoga to someone. And I really wanted to learn that, and I figured, being somewhat legalistic, that I needed the right training and licensure to be allowed to touch people in the state of Nebraska. I went to massage school part-time and went off to California and learned Thai massage and did that for a while on the side. It was really a great experience for me. I learned a lot. It's been a great counterbalance to being a trial and criminal lawyer. In the early 2000s, in 2003, my good friend and colleague Stu Dornan was appointed to fill out the unexpired term of the county attorney who had left to go into private practice, the Douglas County attorney here in Omaha. And I helped him transition into office, and then he offered me a job as one of his chief deputies. And so for about 3.5 years or so, slightly over 3 years, I was a chief deputy in the Douglas County Attorney's Office. Worked on all sorts of different things, mental health, learned how to do a government budget, learned how to manage personnel, and had a great time. In 2006, Stu was defeated in the general election, and I went back to private practice. That year also, I was first asked to teach at UNO, so since 2007, I've been back in private practice and teaching at UNO. Renee Ratner Corcoran, who's doing the filming, just reminded me of a few things that I should maybe mention. One is that most of my practice has been doing criminal law, mostly in the representation of people charged with various crimes. And I've enjoyed that very much. It's not always easy, and it's sometimes very stressful, but I think I like the piece of it that I help people, and that I'm acting in accord with the Constitution, with the way our laws are set up. And there was sort of a tradition in Omaha of Jewish criminal defense lawyers. And I was thinking about this the other day, that I wanted to mention some of these people so they don't get forgotten. Don Fiddler, of course, and his father Al were magnificent lawyers. Mike Levy was a good friend of mine. He was a criminal defense lawyer. Richard Epstein, they've all passed, was a great criminal defense lawyer. And I guess I kind of feel like maybe I'm in league with those guys. Alan Stoller, who just passed in the last year, was a magnificent criminal defense lawyer, and just before he died won a case in the United States Supreme Court. So there's something about that, about how I think Jewish people bring compassion to the practice of law. One great Jewish judge, whose name escapes me right now, said there ought to be a writ of Rachmanis, a writ of compassion. And I think maybe as Jews, because we've been oppressed, because we know what it feels like to have the state against us, maybe we have an affinity for this kind of thing. I don't know. Recently, switching gears, I was on the board at Temple Israel. We've been members of Temple since the B'nai Israel split. And I spent a couple of wonderful years working with Rosie Zweiback, who was the president, and Dennis DePort, who was the executive director of Temple Israel, and I wanted to mention that. One other aspect of my life that's come about in the last few years is working with some local philanthropist funders on projects to bring meditation into the mainstream, meditation and mindfulness. And we just, he just gave out grants to 8 local nonprofit organizations to train all of their leadership to use meditation and mindfulness in the running of their organizations. We're working with the University of Nebraska Medical Center to measure the results of those interventions, and that's been also very much fulfilling for me. I wanted to talk a little bit about growing up Jewish in Omaha, and grandchildren, if you're listening, this is for you, at least in part. I mentioned in part 1 that a lot of those people who I was in AZA 1 with or in SYO were people that I maintained relationships with throughout my life. A couple that I didn't mention in that first group, I'm surprised when I listened to that. I didn't mention Mike Abramson, who's been my friend and my accountant forever. Tom Goodman, whose daughter worked for Rebecca on the farm, Betsy. Betsy's going to get married here in a couple months. You form lasting relationships. Not that they go without tending. You have to have a friend, you have to be a friend, and you have to make time in your life to have those people around. And I found that to be very fulfilling. And that widens. Alan Stoller was somebody I didn't know growing up. He was just enough older than me that I didn't know him, but we had so many friends in common that once we did meet, it was very easy, and had a sort of a common ground of information and friends and influences. So, Amaris and Theo, you're at the CDC now. As we're speaking, maybe literally now. It's just about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're probably meeting and playing with some of those kids that in 20 or 30 or 40 years you'll be able to say, I've known them since I was 4 or 5 or 2 even. And maybe you'll move away. Maybe you won't know those people. Who knows what the future brings. But it's a wonderful opportunity, and no matter where you are, I think those lessons on friendship are invaluable. Same thing with family relations. Sometimes it takes a little bit of going out of your way to maintain a relationship with your family. Just last night, Jason Bloom, who is the oldest of my brother Bernard's children. Bernard is the other twin, and he passed away in 2014. Jason was in town. He's a jury consultant, and he was working on a big case for a company that's got a products liability claim against it. And so we gathered all the Omaha relatives, and we all went out and had pizza. And just a couple nights before that, we had all gathered at Susie Fellman's house. She made a wonderful vegan Erev Rosh Hashanah dinner. And those are the things you remember, right? Doesn't mean that you have to stay at home. Go out, have as many adventures as you possibly can. Enjoy life, love, get your heart broken, love again, do all of those things. but I think at it's either Alex or Eli's bar mitzvah, we talked a lot about not forgetting where you're from and who your people are. So I guess I just hope that in this little video, I've given you a taste of what it was like, where you come from. If you're seeing this video for the first time and I'm no longer alive, I would hope that somebody found in my things, I suppose maybe I'll always have an office, I don't know. I suppose I'll always have a filing cabinet, maybe. I've got at least one brown manila expandable folder, maybe two, of genealogy, birth certificates, death certificates, newspaper articles, things that my mother wrote about her family and about my dad's family. And it's probably more than I can go into here. I suppose maybe I should do that on occasion. Do that whole family history and genealogy on tape. But then you'd have to listen to me and watch me, and you couldn't go through all those papers at your own pace. So, I think as Jews it's interesting to know where you came from. When I was little, they didn't talk about it. My grandparents that I knew on the Bloom side, I didn't know the ones on my mother's side except for my step-grandmother. They didn't want to talk so much about coming from the old country. Those were hard times for them. And now it's become more interesting for me to learn about what it was like to live in those times and what shaped the influences. Why were we all pushed to become doctors and lawyers and successful and work for ourselves rather than working for someone else so that we'd always have a living, my mom would say. So I think what happened over those generations in coming from Europe and being poor and being uneducated, but having a thirst for knowledge, really formed how I was raised, how my siblings were raised, probably how a lot of the people who were these, were really the second generation that was born here, how our lives were shaped, that emphasis on community, education, relationships, that we were part of that melting pot, but we still retained our identity. I think a good example of the melting pot in Omaha was the way Orthodox Judaism was practiced in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s in Omaha. Orthodox Judaism today looks a lot more like Orthodox Judaism of a longer time ago, with more emphasis on the old rules and how the Hasidim and the other the various sects of Hasidim practice Judaism, sort of the joyful end of things, the very devout practice of observing the mitzvot. In the 1960s, there were so many people in Omaha who had belonged to the synagogues that became Beth Israel, the Orthodox synagogue. So Beth Israel was a merger of other smaller synagogues that were created by people from the various regions in Europe, the Latvians and the Polish. They had their own synagogues, and then it became untenable. They couldn't support them. In the 50s, I think it was, that Beth Israel was created. And it was very much, I call it a go-along, get-along kind of orthodoxy. The parking lot was full on Shabbat when you weren't supposed to drive. The rabbi dressed very Western, did not have a beard. Rabbi Nadoff, no big black hat, no talus katan showing out of his shirt or his waistband. And people were trying to make it. My parents' generation, the first generation of American-born Jews, they were in business, or some of them had the fortune to go to college and become doctors and lawyers. They wanted to maintain their culture and their history. A lot of them kept kosher in the home. But they didn't want to stand out so much. They wanted to be part of the business community. And this is a balance that I think we've had to continually readjust in this culture, to be able to maintain your own identity as a Jew or as an Italian, as someone from Central America, from Europe, from anywhere, and still become part of this melting pot. I think it's very important to do that. I think it's the way America succeeded in the 20th century. And as a small political aside, I see too much divisiveness now based upon race or religion or sexual orientation, any of those sorts of things. It just seems too bad that people can't just get along. We're all just people. Maybe that's a good place to end.